Thanks very much, John. Our third speaker this morning, and coming from a slightly different perspective in relation to carbon policy, is Ben Keogh, the Managing Director of Australian Carbon Traders. And to answer the obvious question, no, we're not related, and that should be obvious from the differences in hairstyles and rugged good looks between the two of us. Ben has a detailed understanding of the complex issues facing participants in the growing carbon market. He has been employed in both the public and the private sectors in carbon sequestration, environmental management, whole farm planning, native forestry and agricultural production. He has worked within the ever-changing carbon market for over 8 years and has advised landholders, businesses, governments on the impacts of carbon policies. He's been involved in carbon sequestration projects for a variety of clients, including the CVGA, the 2006 Commonwealth Games tree planting project, various councils and private landholders. He developed and was director of Landcare's Carbon Smart project. He started Australian Carbon Traders in 2004 to meet the growing demand for emissions trading and carbon abatement, with a particular focus on the agriculture sector. There are very few people in Australia as qualified as Ben to talk about the realities of participating in the carbon market rather than the theory, so we look forward to his address. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Mick. It's really great to have this opportunity to talk to you all. If I do appear a little bit nervous, it's generally because when I'm standing in a suit in front of a panel of my peers, I'm known as the defendant. So I'll do my best to get through the presentation because I know we're a little bit behind time. Now, just as a purely indulgent thing, can I just get a show of hands from the people in the audience who actually believe in climate change? Stick your hands up. Now, that's excellent. Now, keep them up. Keep them. Hang on a minute. Put them back up. I have to get a photo for the government. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Now, it is interesting because I have asked that question to a lot of people in a lot of presentations. I've done hundreds of these around Australia, and it's been very interesting to listen to the two chaps that came before me looking at the industry component of it, because I spend most of my time dealing with landholders. And one of the issues I heard was, do we think agriculture is actually going to be covered in the future? But if you look at the actual likelihood of that happening, I don't think agriculture is going to be covered as a sector. And the main reason is that by picking up 300 or so of the larger emitting companies in Australia, we pick up about 85% of our emissions from Australia. But if we move it to take up the other 15 or so percent that comes from agriculture, you've got to deal with 150,000 landholders. And it's an administrative nightmare. I don't know that that's going to happen. But having said that, it was also interesting to listen to some of the comments about the politics and the green, the influence of the Greens. And I've said to many people in the past that I think the biggest issue is that elections are actually won in Fitzroy, not Fitzroy Crossing. And until that changes, I don't think you're going to have as much say as you'd like. The other thing is, I don't have time to go through all the mechanics of the carbon farming initiative. I'm going to look at it more from a landholder's perspective, a small operator's perspective, that 150,000 people I spoke of. But firstly, if anyone thinks there's a get-rich-quick scheme in the carbon farming initiative, I'll point to the door now. It is not. And I'm evidence of that myself, because I remember when I said to my wife in 2004 that I'm going to start a carbon brokering business. My wife said to me, "That's nice, dear." She came back to me a couple of years later and said, when you said you're going to be a carbon broker, you didn't really explain what broker meant, because we keep getting broker and broker every year. And that's part of the challenges we face, is that the carbon market is not like any other market. It is actually a policy construct. And that policy construct means we are at the whims of policy decisions. And we've already heard today about the issues that we face with politicians and talking of repeal and changing things around. And those changes can make dramatic impacts on how you actually price risk into your investments. And we've heard a little bit about that today, about the uncertainty about how would you actually go and tackle climate change from an industry perspective when you're uncertain about how long it's going to appear. But I can tell you, whether you believe in the science or not, the climate change is real. It is definitely real to us, and that's because governments are making decisions based on climate change being real, and consumers are making decisions based on climate change being real, which really makes it quite real to us. Okay, so whether you believe the science or not, there are impacts on us because of climate change. And the government's response to this is actually to make a policy response, because that's what governments do. And I won't go into too much detail about this, but the Australian policy response is bipartisan. It is both parties at the moment have the same target of reducing our 2000 level emissions by 5% by 2020. How they go about it is quite different. Now, Australia's got this thing called the Clean Energy Future. Has anyone heard of the Clean Energy Future? otherwise known as the carbon tax. You might have heard of that. So the carbon tax or the clean energy future is simply a cap and trade approach, and the idea is to change behaviour, is to hit people in the hip pocket by pricing carbon so that it'll drive consumers to use lower carbon intensive goods and services and makes lower carbon intensive goods and services more competitive. We also have a second tier to this policy response where people are going to be rewarded for activities that reduce emissions or sequester carbon or take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the vegetation and the soils, which we know as the Carbon Farming Initiative. But it is important to remember that these are policy constructs. The clean energy future in Australia, which is the carbon tax, is basically this cap and trade approach. And I won't go through the details on it, and I think just towards the bottom of the slide there is how these companies get these certificates that they have to do. For every emission that a company creates over 25,000 tonnes, well, if they're 25,001, they have to get 25,001 certificates. And they get them in 4 basic ways. They can either get them compensation from the government, free for emissions intensive or trade exposed industries. They'll be able to purchase them from the government auction or straight from the government, purchase from the secondary market, but most importantly to us, they can purchase from this domestic and international offsets market, and that's where we want to focus today, on that domestic offsets market. The Clean Energy Future and the Carbon Farming Initiative are separate pieces of legislation. The Carbon Farming Initiative is linked to the Clean Energy Future by a mechanism in there that allows companies that have an exposure to the carbon price or a liability can purchase up to 5% of their emissions offset during the fixed price period. After that, they can buy as much as they like, up to 100%. But until 2020, companies must get half of their emissions liabilities from Australian sources. But just during the fixed price period, while we have this known price, it equates to around about 50 million tonnes if we can completely fill the order, which winds up to be about $1.25 billion worth of money. So there's a fair bit of money out there that could be taken by the by the liable entities. The Clean Energy Future also raises a fair bit of money in the first few years, and the government has allocated a certain amount of that to the agricultural sector. It works out to about $1 to $1.25 billion, which is dominated by 2 major funds, being the $946 million Biodiversity Fund for planting and establishing biodiversity activities that have a carbon component, and $250 million into a non-Kyoto fund. The other important thing about the Carbon Farming Initiative is, as is often told, is that we can actually export the credits. So those credits that we create, or carbon credits in the agricultural sector, can actually be sold overseas. The next thing is looking at the actual little bit of the impact on the price on carbon and agriculture. Now, it's true that agriculture is excluded from a carbon price, which means you're not responsible for the direct emissions coming from burping cattle or from nitrous oxide releases from fertiliser. But that's all well and good, and it's a nice headline. But the reality is, as has been mentioned, is farmers are going to get squeezed. There is going to be increases in costs on diesel, electricity, transport, steels, chemicals, fertilisers, plastics. If you think about the individual landholder and what they actually use on their property, remembering that the idea behind the Carbon Farming Initiative, behind a carbon price, is to actually drive people to different goods and services, I don't know where a lot of these alternatives are going to be. So farmers are actually going to get squeezed the other way as well, because, as we've heard today, transport, handling and processing costs are also expected to rise. So farmers will definitely get squeezed. The interesting thing is, and remembering that Carbon Farming Initiative is a market-based mechanism, is that the organisations that are responsible for these activities, for providing the inputs and taking the products from farmers, are quite often the companies that actually need carbon credits. Now, because agriculture is excluded, farmers are the only sector of the economy that can create carbon offsets. So their suppliers and their purchasers are the very people that need carbon credits. And the challenge for the industry is to get those linkages so that we can actually make sure that companies are purchasing from their supply chain the carbon credits to keep their suppliers in business. Now, it's much better if that money was going to if you're in the dairy industry, for example, that if you were purchasing carbon credits off your dairy farmers and keeping the money in your industry and in your region, rather than sending to Canberra and letting them decide what to do with it. The next thing I want to talk about, a little bit more detail about the Carbon Farming Initiative, is to remember it is a voluntary activity. You don't have to participate if you don't want to, and I've advised plenty of farmers that it's not something they should look at. It doesn't suit their enterprise or their business model or their activities. The Carbon Farming Initiative also has bipartisan approval. If or when the coalition gets elected, they have said they will continue with the Carbon Farming Initiative. They will broaden its scope. They'll change the focus from some of the activities more towards soil carbon and other activities. But one has to remember that most of the activities that we're talking about in carbon farming is really about carbon and farming. We're not talking about competitive measures, we're talking about complementary measures. I certainly don't want to see wall-to-wall trees. I don't want to see good agricultural country taken out of production. But it doesn't really compete. If you look at things like planting trees in the Mallee in Victoria, for example, you might get 20 to 30 of maybe $50 a tonne, $50 a hectare. compared to $1 to $2 a tonne, 1 to 2 tonnes per hectare of wheat, which you might get $500, $600, $700 after costs, it's not going to compete. So there is a big myth out there that we can lose all our cropping country and turn it into trees. It's just not happening. It's not going to happen, and unless the price of carbon goes through the roof, which means we've got all sorts of other problems with climate change to worry about rather than just trees. Most of the actions that we're talking about will actually prepare you for the predicted climate change. It doesn't matter if you believe in climate change or not. Australia is a land of extremes. We have very hot days and very cold days. It can provide revenue through the carbon credits to offset those increased costs. It can actually reduce your exposure to the carbon price as well because you become more efficient with your carbon-intensive goods and services, and it can increase the productivity of your property by having more efficient animals or pastures or some tree crops. The Carbon Farming Initiative is broad. It covers most activities on the land. It has very broad scope. I like to look at as the Carbon Farming Initiative as just another tool in the toolbox. All right, it is another tool, but it's one hell of a tool. It's an amazing tool. It can do amazing things. The trouble is they gave us the instructions in ancient Celtic and hieroglyphics. The government is very good at telling us what to do, but not how to do it. And that's one of the reasons we're having some problems. It's probably easier in many regards in the early stages to think about the Carbon Farming Initiative in terms of the key concepts that are there. And these are my interpretations of the integrity principles that override or guide the Carbon Farming Initiative. Ultimately, what we're talking about is land use and land use change. And we're talking to landholders now about making decisions based on the land use they have. So you have to consider what is the change in carbon associated with that parcel of land that can be attributed to mine management. What is the net effect on the atmosphere? How do I measure it and report on those changes? Is my method backed by science? Is it consistent with international rules, which change pretty regularly? Is it beyond business as usual? Is it additional? Is it over and above what I would normally do? And is it a permanent change? And that permanent change is a very interesting one, because when you look at the permanent change, you want to know, can it be reversed? So if you plant trees or sequester carbon in your soil, that carbon can be lost. So you have to provide mechanisms to ensure that it's going to stay there for 100 years. And that's where the 100-year rule comes from. And that concept is based on the integrity of the scheme to ensure that every carbon credit that is issued is backed by the equivalent amount of carbon on site. So, without too much more ado, where are the opportunities within carbon farming? And you'll note here I've just written opportunities because I haven't written viable opportunities. I like to think in terms of sources and sinks. And on that list you'll see a number of different opportunities on the sources side, and that's where emissions are coming from. And if I can stop that and those emissions going into the atmosphere, I can turn them into a carbon credit. On the other side of it, I have the sinks, where I take it out of the vegetation, out of the atmosphere, and store it in my vegetation and soils. The important difference between these two is it is only the sinks that have the 100-year rule. All right, it's only when you take carbon out of the atmosphere is when you have to keep it out for 100 years. If you're undertaking the other activities on the abatement side and it's not working out for it, you can stop it without any interest, without any penalty. Because once you've stopped the abatement, you've permanently stopped it. So if you stop your cow burping for a couple of months, you've stopped it. You can't squeeze it a little harder and get those emissions back. So looking at those opportunities, you have a look in this graph here, you'll see where the breakdown of agricultural emissions come from. And this is where can we stop these emissions. And you'll see that clearly most of the emissions that we have in the agricultural sector come from enteric fermentation. That's basically the burping of cattle, mainly. A little bit comes from agricultural soils, and a fair bit comes from the prescribed burning of burning of savannas. Now, looking at that, you would think that the biggest opportunities we have are in the enteric fermentation management. But if you look at what the government has put out, the Department of Climate Change, having a look what emissions we can sort of look at, or credits we can generate in 2020. The two lines there is the red lines, or the red bars, are the high uptake, where we get lots of participants, and the blue bars are where we have much lower uptake. And this is just 2020, not up till 2020. And you can see there that the enteric fermentation, while it's one of our biggest emitters, is not one of our biggest opportunities. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. One, we haven't done the research. Two, we haven't worked out how to do it yet. And many of the options we're looking at are going to take time to implement and develop. If I show you this graph in 2030, it's going to be a very different graph. We will have exhausted a lot of the opportunities we have in revegetation of degraded rangelands and avoided deforestation and regrowth. A lot of those opportunities in reforestation, we will have capacity. The CFI is not a magic bullet, but it is an opportunity to actually buy time before we develop other ways of abating emissions. I'll only do a couple of these slides, but looking at some of the opportunities that are out there is plenty of opportunities for people. But again, we don't know all these opportunities exactly, and part of the reason that we have a carbon farming initiative that is a market-based mechanism is to unlock the innovative capacity that lives out there on the farm and to get that actually working, because there are lots of opportunities but we haven't developed them yet. So for things like broadacre and cropping and grazing opportunity, there's all sorts of opportunities along the areas of fertiliser efficiency, soil carbon sequestration, well-planned forestry. Okay, when you're looking at forestry, I try to say to people you need to integrate it into your farm, because with the forestry activities, if you can do a good whole farm plan approach first, have a look at where you can actually put the trees, and if they're going to add to cross-production benefits, and then some clown in Sydney wants to pay you for it, I'd take their money. Look at enteric fermentation. There's opportunities in intensive ag opportunities for enteric fermentation, for feed supplements, early finishing, more methane, more meat, less methane, and in the future genetic manipulation, methane capture and destruction. Pastoralists at the moment, they have an early season burning program out there, a methodology that allows people in areas over 1,000 millimetres of rainfall to enter into early season burning to stop the big fires that occur. They have obviously feral animal control. There is a methodology out at the moment for shooting camels. We took care of them all in Victoria, so we're not going to be using that one. There's plenty of opportunities in agricultural services as well, but we have to see whether these are viable. And again, I didn't put the word viable in there. It's interesting to hear about the rates of return you're expecting, because when we deal with people in the investment capital arrangement, they come to us and say, well, come up with this carbon farming opportunity for us, and we want 30 to 40% return on investment over 3 years. And I say, it's agriculture, you do get that, don't you? But that's what we're competing with, where that's what the expectation is. And if you're not going to get at least 6 or 7%, you're better off putting your money in the bank. And that cost of capital is very difficult, because whether it's forestry or whether it's putting the money into research and development, or it's building a biodigester and to stick on your lagoons, they're capital intensive at the start, as was mentioned. And to get that capital out is difficult, particularly when you've got this long-term or short-term political risk that it's all going to be pulled out from under your feet. But I think one of the important things that people need to look at carbon farming is that, again, it's a complementary measure. You're looking at the integrated carbon farming. Landholders might be running multiple projects, and we've got some challenges in the industry, and particularly when dealing with government departments, to see that we start to get some practicality into it so that landholders can actually run these systems on their own and have some control over it. Because at the moment, it is a bit of a quagmire of administration. Just to become a recognised offset entity, your project proponent requires the filling out of 48 pages of forms. And we all know how much landholders love filling out forms. There's ongoing monitoring and reporting, but I like to see it as, it's going to add to the benefit. So you'll get some money out of your carbon farming income, you'll get some, but you'll also get probably as much, if not more, out of your cross-production benefits, but your farming income is always going to be your primary income source. You need to see that carbon is part of the farming business, not the entire farming business. I can tell you, if you could buy a property, plant trees on it and make money out of it, I wouldn't be here today. I'd probably be one of the biggest landholders in Australia, because I've been looking for that property for 8 years and I haven't found it. That's how I started my business, in fact, was looking for that perfect property. You need to see the carbon as part of the long-term management objectives as well, particularly when looking at sequestration. Make sure you put the trees in the right place, but don't worry too much. We're pretty good at getting rid of them in Australia if we have to. You can... and think particularly when things like soil carbon, and if you're storing carbon in your soil, there's many, many very good reasons to put carbon back into your soil. Somewhere near the bottom of the list is carbon trading. And that's the harsh reality, is that I've spent 8 years dealing in carbon credits and no one has ever asked me for a tonne of soil carbon. Right? So, and I think it's some time away. And you've got to be very careful about why you do that. And when you put that into it, how is it going to affect your management options in the future? If you've got to keep it out for 100 years, please predict how farming is going to look in 100 years' time, what sort of activities will be occurring. So just at the very end of it, whether they've got paddocks of gold or a get-rich-quick scheme, you've got to remember carbon farming is a policy construct. It's not driven by the need to put food in people's bellies or fibre on people's backs. It's not driven by the same drive as many other agricultural commodities are. It takes time. You're either turning around ecosystem processes or you're actually trying to change embedded farming practices, and we all know how difficult that can be. So I'd like to finish there because I'm quite conscious of time, and thank you very much for your time.